turn on the mics. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Liberty Series program. The Legacy Foundation is a nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia, and we, of course, as you all know, live by the values, the principles, and we use the history of this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, for citizenship programs, for scholarships for tomorrow's future leaders, and for lectures like tonight's Liberty Series program. Someone asked me tonight, one of our speakers asked me tonight, how much do you charge for this? And I said, well, we don't charge anything, but I will make a pitch. So this is the pitch. Please support the Legacy Foundation. We need your support to make these programs happen. We have programs that reach thousands of thousands, not just members, but of course, all those others that need to understand the greatness of our culture, of our civilization, and of course, our great Constitution. So I please ask you to make a gift to the Legacy Foundation if you already haven't. A few housekeeping items before we start our program. First, if you would please silence your cell phone, or better yet, turn it off, if anyone does that anymore. The program will last about an hour in total. We will have a Q&A at the end. You should all have a card. Please feel free to fill out a question. Kira and Becca and other members of our staff will come around towards the end of the discussion part of the program to collect them, and we'll get to as many as possible this evening. A few upcoming programs. And we do take a little bit of a break because on April 6th is Good Citizen Day, where nearly 300 high school juniors will be here in this room to learn about what we all care about and learn how to be better citizen leaders. But our next program, lecture program, is on April 12th, our library hour, Age of Acrimony with John Grinspan. It should be a great program. And then April 26th, the day before the 200th anniversary of Ulysses S. Grant, we will have a program with Ron White, a Civil War roundtable. And then the next night, the Union League will be hosting a grant ball, a U.S. grant ball at Liberty Hill. And I don't know if Bob Cavalier, our 160th chair, is here, but that's all in partnership with the 160th committee in a celebration of the 160 years of the Union League of Philadelphia. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, my boss, the one, the only, Ms. Joan Carter. Joan.
Thank you, John. So I always start with the first line of the Union League bylaws, which says that every member shall support the Constitution and the free enterprise system. But we don't often think about where those ideas come from. I mean, they didn't just appear in 1776. So ideas like individuals, individualism, individual liberty, logic, and reason, did they come from the ancient world or the philosophic traditions of the Asia or Africa? Tonight, we're going to talk about the civilization that made the Constitution and the free enterprise possible, Western civilization. And we'll explore the attacks on civilization that threaten the existence of our republic. Moderating our program is Mr. Joe LeConte. You may recall that Joe was our speaker at the February Liberty Series program. He's an Enlightenment scholar, a film producer, author, and the director of the Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. And our featured speaker tonight is Heather McDonald. Heather's a Thomas Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She writes regularly for a very wide variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal. And what I really love about her is she takes on topics that many authors will not. Subjects like mask mandates and revisionist art curators. And one of my favorites, classical music suicide pact. and how math and science have become victims of Congress's demand for racial justice. She's the author of several books, including War on Cops and The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. So please join me in welcoming Joe LeConte and Heather McDonald.
That's your mic. There we go.
Thank you.
Got it, okay. Well, welcome, everybody. Can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats? Okay. Terrific. Well, as we get into it here, I wanted to say a couple things here. That Heather McDonald, she's one of the few public intellectuals who was willing to defend Western civilization without apology. Without apology. Yeah, that's right. And Western civilization needs defending right now, doesn't it? Because the crisis moment that we're in, and it really is a crisis moment, it does bring to mind, as an historian, it brings to mind the 1920s and the 1930s with the rise of new ideologies in the wake of the First World War that have become so cynical of the Western tradition. Communism, of course, fascism, Nazism, eugenics, materialism, scientism, all of these ideologies were a repudiation of the Western classical biblical tradition. There's a line here from Walter Lippmann. He was a well-known columnist and public intellectual writing in the 1920s. 1929, he put it this way: the modern man has ceased to believe, meaning ceased to believe in that great classical Western tradition. He ceased to believe, but he's not ceased to be credulous, and the need to believe haunts him. It is plain we have succeeded only in substituting trivial illusions for majestic faiths. Heather McDonald has been exposing these illusions for many years. And I have to say, Ms. McDonald, you are no stranger to controversy. If I could just say quickly, in 2017, all 5 of the undergraduate colleges that make up the Claremont colleges protested your scheduled speaking appearance and signed a petition against you. I hate to bring up this ancient history, but it underscores the problem. Here's what they said. They signed a petition. Heather McDonald is a fascist, a white supremacist, a war hawk, a transphobe, and a queerphobe. Quite a resume. But the Claremont petition proves your point, doesn't it, about the moral degradation of much of higher education? Not all of it, but much of it. Ms. McDonald understands what is now at risk. Western civilization, the foundation of it, our ideals, our institutions, they're at great risk. They're being shaken. I love what you said in an interview a couple of years ago. You said this: one of the greatest human virtues is gratitude. Gratitude. The purpose of higher education, you said, is to help students understand why they should be down on their knees in gratitude for the beauty and sublimity of the Western tradition. No other civilization compares. Ladies and gentlemen, again, join me in welcoming Heather McDonald, if you would. So we've got a few questions for you, Heather. Let's start with this. It's probably good to just give us a brief description of what you understand to be the Western tradition. Maybe just summarize some of its distinctive qualities that set apart the Western tradition from other traditions.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. LeConte, and thank you also, Ms. Carter and Mr. Miko. This is a great honor to be at the Union League Club. Union, you're still using the word, that's probably going to be canceled, just like color blindness. But I know that you brave Union Leaguers will be ready to defend your title and your place in Philadelphia in national history. And you bring up the ridiculous blockade at Claremont McKenna. Having come out of a jag of speaking engagements at colleges, it's an unusual situation for me now to have an audience that's still in its seats and is not trying to blockade the place or walk out in screaming hysteria. So thank you for giving me a hearing. I appreciate it. as far as what makes Western civilization distinctive, I'm going to start at a very homely level rather than the large, big ideas that of course are what ultimately is going to animate us here tonight. But I've become obsessed recently with materials, and I mean literally materials. In this venerable hall, they're fairly traditional, but when you go back to your house tonight or your apartment, check out your kitchen. There's just a dizzying array of composite formica, various types of steel, counters, things that we utterly take for granted, that some scientist, some engineer somewhere has worked at to make human life even more safe from the depredations of nature. And this comes out of this extraordinary curiosity that began taking off in the 17th century in Britain with the Royal Society and across the European continent to try to explain and understand nature. And you had amateur scientists tinkering, whether it's Harvey to try and understand the circulation of the blood, or the aristocrat Lavoisier working on chemistry, an insatiable appetite to use our reason to try to get at the secrets of nature. And that curiosity spread into many other things. It has been one of the signal aspects of Western civilization. We're now supposed to be constantly apologizing for the age of exploration. And certainly when the European sailors and explorers arrived at new continents, they did try to subjugate them. You know what? The people on those continents would have done the same to us had they had the technology to do so. The desire for power is hardly unique, but the capacity to understand the world, to explore it, to grow the scope of human experience has been uniquely Western. We saw the scientific method develop, this extraordinary way of testing causation, the randomized controlled experiment, which is one of the great vehicles of understanding, comes out of the West. And what also comes out of the West is the respect for individual rights. The rule of law is uniquely Western. The idea of due process, of being able to presume innocence, something that terrifyingly the products of our most elite law schools are now canceling the idea of the presumption of innocence. Every time you hear the mantra, believe survivors, which was the thing that they tried to bring Brett Kavanaugh down with. You had the graduates and the students of Yale and Harvard law schools, our future federal judges, chanting believe survivors. If that mentality gets on the federal bench, we can forget the rule of law and the possibility of justice before a tribunal. Our universities are on a mission to tear everything down.
Wow.
But the ideas of individual freedom, of limited government, the thing that the left, every idea that the left is now using to turn on our inheritance are uniquely Western ideas, whether it's tolerance, justice, individual rights. They are fighting the West with Western tools. And the spirit of critique, they have also taken to unjustified lengths. But that too is a uniquely Western trait of self-examination, articulation of fundamental principles, and then challenge to those principles. These ideas have given the world prosperity that was unthinkable as little as 200 years ago.
Ms. McDonald, thank you for that. I want to pick up that thought for a minute, though, on the scientific revolution, which
Yeah.
is terrific that you made that point. I mean, it brings to mind this line about the early scientists. They really believed that God had written two books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. And the study of the one would reveal the other. And I remember there's a line from John Newton, of course, Newton, this great, the foundations of science laid by Newton, where he said, Plato is my friend and Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth. The desire for truth, the pursuit of truth. What do you make of that? I mean, this used to be a Western distinctive, the desire to pursue truth wherever it leads.
Well, we have become profound skeptics, and skepticism too is a trait of the West. So it is an extraordinarily broad tradition, but the effort to critique forms of government, you have the Socratic dialogues of a constant back and forth of holding received wisdom up to analysis. Can we figure out a principle that can explain a variety of different phenomena, whether it's in the law or in science? And so the pursuit of truth has been an animating function, but the skepticism towards truth is
Yes.
also Western.
Yes.
And I have to admit,
Yes.
I am a product of a 1970s college education that was sadly far too immersed in ridiculous French theories coming out of Paris that were profoundly postmodern and believed that truth is really just a function of power or is inevitably partial. There's a part of me, I will confess, to be honest, that is persuaded by that up to a point. I do think the process of interpretation is endless. I'm not sure that it is within human capacity to reach a single agreed upon truth. All I can see empirically that disagreement is an aspect of human existence that has always been with us.
Yes.
Nevertheless, for all of my academic relativism, when I'm writing about the Black Lives Matter movement and the lies that are being told about the police, and I am trying to put forward data that show that there's no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police, I absolutely believe that I'm in pursuit and actually in possession of the truth. So I can have two different mindsets.
Well, you're no wilting wallflower, we can say that. Let me pick up this theme of gratitude, if we could, though, that you raised so beautifully in that interview. Can we get to the root of the reasons that gratitude for our civilization, it seems that it's become such a rare commodity, not just in higher education, but in the larger culture, gratitude. Can we get to the root causes of this, do you think?
Well, here's another aspect of the way that the West is so universal and so broad in its accomplishments that it can be self-canceling. I date a lot of our current problems to the extraordinary success of free market capitalism, which is also a product of Western principles, the idea of free trade overseen by property rights, the amazing understanding that a respect for property is the foundation of a stable civilized society. And we went so far in combining the courage, the imagination of these empire builders, these capitalist kings, and I'm not going to use the phrase robber barons because they were not robbing, they were by and large creating wealth, but the extraordinary power of capitalism created something in the 1950s that had never before been seen in human history: adolescents with spending power. We were so rich as a society that parents could hand their teenage children credit cards or checks or whatever they were using at the time. And corporations spotted a new market and they started developing a youth culture to cater to this new source of market demand. And when you have corporations treating adolescents who know nothing, who are ignorant, who are self-righteous, puffed up with their own desire for power and grandiosity, when you have them treated respectfully by record companies and entertainment companies, trying to sever them off, you know, they can drive now, and they've got their whole youth culture. We started elevating youth to a position of power. You wouldn't know it by looking at our political class today. You look at our political class and Biden and Nancy Pelosi, you think this is the most Confucian society that's ever been. We venerate age, but in fact, the culture is still driven by this obsession with youth.
Wow.
Youth are not grateful. They take everything for granted. They believe they're the first to ever feel injustice. And they have no sense of perspective. And of course, increasingly, due to the failure of will and the failure to pass on solid, substantive knowledge, they are ignorant. And so I think that this lack of gratitude and sense of remaking the world that you saw in the 1960s with the college rebels, and no understanding of the work of centuries that it took to develop the idea of a limited constitutional government. Here in Philadelphia, in further advance of a written constitution, ideas of the separation and balance of powers, ignorant of all of that. And I think that youth orientation of profound narcissism and belief that you can start the world anew and the world should rotate around your own petty grievances, that is now mutated into the poison and just patheticness of identity politics, is a product of ultimately of that youth culture.
Yes, let me pick up that point, that maybe combine the two, the youth culture, but also the private property point that you made, because it seems to me, and I want you to unpack this maybe a little bit more, the idea that private property, that our own possessions, our intellectual property, the fruit of our creative energies and gifts, that this should be a natural right, an inalienable right. That's very John Locke, right? Life, liberty, and property, the founders picked up on. That's a Western idea, isn't it? I mean, that is a distinctively Western idea. Do you want to maybe just unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, the alternative is collectivism, it's tribalism. Most societies have been tribal. We were tribal too. You know, we've had tribes coming through Europe, and that sense of blind obedience to a group is really, you can say, almost the natural human condition. And it was, you saw pushing back against that with the Greeks in 5th century Athens, and the development of, again, individual reason coming out and individuals having the capacity to question their current arrangements, to ask questions of justice. And that too is very unusual. The protection of property and the sense that what you work at and have improved, that you have a right to possess that and to trade with under the rule of law and make contracts, that really was a Western development.
And when you see the negation of it, as you suggest, with the whole communist vision, the whole communist vision is to eliminate private property, and somehow you'll solve the problem of human nature. Everyone will get along, and off we go to Shangri-La. And we see what happens with the negation of the concept of private property. It just leads to human misery. But young people don't necessarily grasp that, do they? Often.
The universal book on freshman reading lists these days in colleges is inevitably Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility. I'm going to be very honest with you. I have begun my reading in the totalitarian literature very late in life. And I don't know how one lives with that history. It is almost unbearable to know what human beings have been capable of when given unlimited power. The cruelty, the gratuitous sadism. I don't know how one can go on. We should, and so the book that should be read by every freshman coming to college is Gulag Archipelago. But we are ignorant. It is out of sight, out of mind. You college students dare to complain about white supremacy in current day America? This is against every empirical fact. But let us never forget what human beings are capable of when the rule of law breaks down and when rulers are given unlimited power. It's not just property that's at stake. It is the very capacity to have a private life.
Yes.
That Orwell, 1984, one of the great prescient books, understood. You destroy the private realm.
Yes.
Which again is something that was very important in Western ideals.
So private property just stands in the way of the entire totalitarian project, doesn't it? In
Right.
so many ways, right?
Right.
You have written about the lack of courage in defending our civilizational inheritance. It's incredible, this lack of civilizational confidence that we seem to have, the self-loathing. You've written about the lack of courage. And, this is happening in the West, it seems to me and to many others, at the precise moment when, say, the Ukrainians, they are displaying a kind of moral courage, it seems to many of us, the likes of which, we haven't seen in our lifetimes. So this idea of courage, civilizational courage and confidence. I mean, when a President Zelensky says, I don't need a ride, I need bullets. As an American, I feel a little bit kind of ashamed almost of being an American and wondering if we have the same kind of courage and fortitude to defend our rights and our freedoms. Talk about this lack of civilizational courage. And is there maybe a moment being created with this crisis in Europe right now to get us to think, to step back and think about what we have and what could be lost?
Well, let me give you a little glimpse inside my Upper East Side apartment building where I live. Healthy 30-year-old men are still double masked in the elevator. Worse, in my neighborhood in Yorkville, they're still wearing masks outdoors, and they're still wearing masks in Central Park, surrounded by trillions of atoms of fresh air, which make it a literal impossibility to encounter enough viral dose to become infected. These are the people who purport to be defending science that know nothing about infectious disease. The CDC's own guidelines for contact tracing say, we're not interested in you unless you've been in close proximity with somebody in a confined space for 15 minutes. And yet, in my neighborhood, people are still wearing masks in Central Park. So am I very confident that we have the courage that it would take to take up arms to defend ourselves? I'm sadly not confident. And what I see happening, I mean, what the COVID experience, at least in the West, and I could, raise an example against myself, which is China. But my diagnosis for it in the West is with the rise of safetyism and this insane inability to rationally measure costs and benefits and to calculate risks, one type of risks against another type of risk. The COVID nightmare that we are not out of yet has been the greatest failure of policymaking in US history. Nothing compares to see our leaders jettisoning, throwing courageous small businessmen overboard because they have no understanding of the heroism it takes to build a small business. They have no understanding that every worker is essential. They have no understanding that government stimulus spending is not an adequate substitute for private economic activity. And their mandates that came pouring forth that were utterly arbitrary. I mean, these rules about people being chased in public parks in Santa Monica Mountains in LA, the hiking trails being cut off, nobody could walk, they couldn't walk on the beaches. Again, they should have been saying, get outdoors, get exercise, get your 300-pound weight off of you, because we already knew everything that was to be known about COVID was known in March 2020 with the data out of Italy. We already knew the average age of decedents, 80, average comorbidities, 3, obesity, high risk factor. And instead, we were told, stay indoors, bake banana bread, order in food, don't go outside. Everything literally, scientifically, exactly counterindicated. And there you had Governor Cuomo with his nauseating daily conferences in which he would regale the public with stories of his Italian-American grandmother and bonding with his daughters for the first time, making these arbitrary distinctions about color code zones and what degree of COVID cases would lead to shutdowns. These were numbers being pulled out of the hat, and we went along with it. This is what is so worrisome. Oddly, there's been more protests in Europe, but more odd still is Australia. Can you explain that one? We all thought it was like the beacon of liberty and libertarianism. They've gone absolutely nuts. But I would say that our problem in the West is the safetyism. Excuse me to half the audience, but a great problem is a female ethos, which is anti-rational, not a great understanding of the market. I'm sure I'm not speaking to the women here. I'm speaking to the women that are running the University of Pennsylvania, that are running Yale Law School, that were running Harvard Law School, that are taking academia further down the route of irrationality. And so this feminized ethos is going to be very hard to fight. Obviously, Ukraine, it's hilarious to see the media on the one hand, wanting to accentuate the war. On the other hand, they've been surprisingly silent about the fact that Ukraine has been evacuating women and children. Wait a minute, I thought we were not allowed to do that. Isn't this a recognition that men and women are different? But they've gotten away with that so far. We'll see how much longer that lasts. I hope that this creates some kind of deeper understanding of the West. I'm not so certain, we were speaking earlier, I'm not certain Zelensky is necessarily the best exemplar of individual rights, limited government, freedom of the press. He's good, and it's a great advertisement for the Second Amendment and why civilian militias are a good idea. But I think the change is going to have to come within ourselves. And I think it's going to entail taking on the biggest problem of our age. I see a lot of our problems today driven by something that most people don't want to talk about, and we can either do so or not tonight. It's at your discretion, Joe, which is the issue of race in America today.
Yeah, well, this is a question that's occurred to me as we're talking here, and I appreciate your comments there about Governor Cuomo. As an Italian-American, I guess I'll stop baking zucchini bread now. Thank you for that. I guess I'll do that. But I wonder if there's a connection between this lack of civilizational confidence, not knowing what our achievements have been and how we got them. I wonder if there's a connection about that. I think you've implied that there is, and the fear. The absolute fear in the age of COVID. I mean, maybe just unpack that a little bit more, because I don't think anybody would have guessed that we would have done the things that we've done to ourselves with this COVID business. I remember my grandmother, Restituta Aiello. She was a young girl when the first influenza virus broke out in the First World War. And they were carrying bodies out of the buildings, she said, in Brooklyn. They were just carrying the bodies out of everybody was afraid, but they got on with it. 50 million people died at least in influenza. We've lost, and it's tragic what we've lost. We've lost about 5 million or so, right, with this COVID, but 50 million, 10 times the number, and people got on with life as best they could. How do we explain the fear? Is there connection to this lack of understanding of the West and what we've done, what we've achieved? Just throwing it out there.
Well, I think I think it really is a feminized ethos. And if I can say so, I was not surprised. If I can make a plug for an article that was really pretty present right before COVID, I wrote an article in City Journal called The Therapeutic Campus. And it focused on something at Yale University called the Good Life Center, which is basically, I called it the college woke spa. It was really quite appalling. It was in Silliman College, and you could go and rake sand. You could be in a sandbox, and there was massage therapy and scented candles and a bookcase that consisted of self-help manuals and a rewritten Winnie the Pooh, because the original Winnie the Pooh, you see, was presumably too, patriarchal, and the language was too good. A. Milne is one of the great ironists. If you haven't started your children or grandchildren on Winnie the Pooh, please do so. It's not too late, because the British children's literature is one way to inoculate your children against the awfulness of young adult dysfunctional literature. Immerse their ears in the greatness of good literature. So Yale had this Good Life Center, which was utterly feminized ethos of therapy. The college students up to that point had been declaring themselves emotionally traumatized. There was this so-called epidemic of mental trauma and mental illness at Harvard, at Yale. Give me a break. You guys are the most privileged individuals in human history.
Yes.
You are not vulnerable. Yes. You are not at risk.
Yes.
And yet colleges had been cultivating this sense of fragility, and we've also heard that in I think it's all fake when students demand speech codes because they claim that reading Ovid makes them feel unsafe, or that hearing arguments about free speech or about the police make them feel unsafe. I don't believe it. There's people who sort of say, okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. You really do feel unsafe, but this is the Jonathan Haidt argument. Confront your feelings of unsafety head on and learn to control them. I think they're just making an argument as an excuse to give themselves more power. Wow. So the COVID safetyism did not come out of nowhere. Yeah. It came out of an accelerating trend of narcissistic risk aversion to the point that we now have got to with COVID, the idea was zero COVID. Are you kidding me? I mean, it's an absurd idea. But I remember Governor Cuomo at the start of his auditioning for his Oscar award said, if these shutdowns save just one life, it will have been worth it. Well, that's a ridiculous standard. No public policy has ever adopted a save one life standard. With that, we would say nobody can drive on the highway more than 5 miles an hour. We allow people to go at 60, 65 miles, knowing that we will have an average of 40,000 highway deaths a year. We accept that as the risk of other conveniences.
Yes. It brings to mind another moment in the West where there was a complete lack of civilizational confidence, and it's the 1930s. And it's young people. The Oxford Union Society voted in 1933. This is after the First World War, all that trauma. They didn't want to get into another war, no matter what was going on in Germany. They don't want another war. So the Oxford Union Society, all these young people, they vote, this House will under no circumstances fight for king and country. 1933. Well, we know what happens. But then you get a leader. This is where leadership really matters, doesn't it? Because then you get a leader like Winston Churchill. And you have this moment in 1940 with the evacuation of Dunkirk, a complete military disaster. You have to evacuate hundreds of thousands of British and French troops from France into Great Britain, leave behind all that military equipment. I don't know what we would do now if that similar scenario had happened now, but what Churchill did a couple of days after the evacuation from Dunkirk, he tells his cabinet, draw up plans for a cross-channel invasion. 4 years before it happens, before Normandy happens, D-Day, he's drawing up plans for a cross-channel invasion. That's a spirit of confidence, civilizational confidence that they had. But leadership was key. Maybe you want to speak to that.
Absolutely. I mean, rhetoric matters. We are still stirred by an orator who can appeal to our highest nature and best instincts. It is quite extraordinary that the Greeks understood this.
Yes.
Rhetoric can be terrifying. It can be a source of evil, and it can also be a source of good. And as far as Churchill being able to move the British to incredible acts of heroism, we're in this bizarre moment now, the trans moment, where a subpopulation of, I don't know what, 0.003% is now the almost obsessive focus of attention to try and deny the difference between males and females. And we have a concerted crusade to emasculate males. I'm going to speak very honestly, to discredit traditional male virtues of chivalry and heroism, entrepreneurship, risk-taking, setting out across the Atlantic that you've never crossed before in a rickety boat. Conquest, yes, conquest, something that every civilization has wanted to do. And we're trying to demonize those. The American Psychiatric Society says that masculinity is toxic. And we have now, the growing reign of females, but and the effort at younger and younger ages to indoctrinate young people into these utterly counterfactual, unscientific ideas that sex and gender are mere constructs, and boys are being marginalized. Every encouraging public message that's ever sent by an elite institution today is directed exclusively at females. The you go girl ethic, girls who code, boys get nothing. It's amazing, and yet they still rule Silicon Valley. You know why? Because they have that entrepreneurial urge. So what gives me hope is that with every generation, every new child who's born still has its genetic inheritance, and there's still the possibility of reclaiming our biological gifts that say that females have skills and strengths and males have skills and strengths, and there is only so far deliberate culture can do to wipe those out.
Terrific point. Terrific point. Thank you for that. Yes. We just got some questions from the audience here. Thanks to John Miko, the man behind the curtain. But before we get to them, I want to ask one quick question, one last question here, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Western civilization has gone through periods of real darkness, but also periods of renewal, right? Do you have any thoughts about a pathway toward at least a partial renewal of our civilizational confidence? Any thoughts about that? Any, either from examples from history or things you see going on right now that give you some hope in that regard?
Well, I know what needs to happen. I'm not sure it will happen. And again, I'm going to allude back to something I said just in passing. It is my sense, observing on a daily basis with heartbreak, with utter sense of pathos and rage and sorrow, one institution of civilization after another coming down, whether it's as Ms. Carter mentioned, classical music or art museums or science, STEM fields, or or theater. It's all being taken down in the name of racial justice and avoiding disparate impact, because it turns out there's not a single meritocratic, academic standard or behavioral standard that does not have a disparate impact now on a racial basis. And right now, the left is allowing the only explanation that is allowed into the public arena for ongoing racial disparities is racism. It's the only, you can only say the reason that Google does not have 13% Black engineers is because they're discriminating against Black PhDs. You're not allowed to say, but there are almost no Black PhDs in the hiring pool coming out with engineering and physics degrees. You're not allowed to say that. So as long as racism is the only allowable explanation for ongoing racial disparities, the left wins. We are going to have to find the courage to say that there are, without making any comment about individuals and the capacity of individuals to succeed and transcend. Right now, there are cultural reasons that we don't have proportional representation in every single institution. And that culture has to be taken on. And we need to be courageous in being called racist and say, I don't care. When you demonize the cops, guess who pays with their lives? Law-abiding Black residents of high crime neighborhoods. When you demonize law enforcement and say, we're not going to enforce criminal justice laws because they have a disparate impact on Blacks. It's that elderly woman in the South Bronx who stood up at a police community meeting that I attended and out of the blue, apropos of nothing in particular, said, how lovely when we see the police, they are my friends. It's people like her who suffer. So we cannot allow ourselves to be bludgeoned into silence by the phony charge of racism. As long as though that racism remains the predominant diagnosis of American civilization today, right now, things are going to stay very bad, I'm afraid.
Wow, it's back to this issue of courage, isn't it? Having the courage as public leaders to do it. Okay, let's take a question here from the audience. Please discuss the impact of social media, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, on our cultural confidence in Western civilization, the impact of social media on that. It's a big question.
You're talking to somebody who doesn't do Facebook. Still don't understand how it works. I don't run my own Twitter account. So in this, I can only parrot what I have read. It obviously is a accelerator of herd instinct. And and people that back down because the Twitter mob is on them. I have a Twitter account that's run by the Manhattan Institute. I think they censor it on my behalf. So I don't see what comes at me negatively. I don't understand, frankly, why people that are the victims of a Twitter mob don't just wait it out a day or two, because we know the mob is fickle. It'll go on to a victim the next time in a few days or hours. Wait it out. Stick to your guns. Do not allow yourself to be cowed into silence or to changing what you know to be the truth because of some unseen Twitter force. And again, I can only repeat what you guys, I'm sure, have already heard. The social media, Instagram, comparing oneself to others is, females seem particularly susceptible to that group pressure to portray oneself as having a perfect life. That's not a good thing. I would say, females decouple. No parent should be giving his child a smartphone ever. Maybe, I don't know what I do not know what the age would be when a child deserves a smartphone, but as long as possible, do not do it. Because just as capitalism weaned children off of their parents in the 1950s, the internet is another huge source of acid corroding parental authority. So keep them away from it as long as you can. Give them books. The aesthetic pleasure of a book.
Wow.
with illustrations. Again, I go back to the great children's illustrations, E. Shepherd. These are things of utter beauty and preciousness that we should not allow to
Wow.
be put into the memory hole, as
Wow.
Orwell said.
Give them books because, books is the way we kind of pass on the tradition. If I could quote from Aristotle, I just happen to have Aristotle's Politics here with his friends. There's a wonderful line, maybe you can respond to this, Ms. McDonald. But of all the things which I have mentioned, that which most contributes to the permanence of constitutions is the adaptation of education to the form of government, a good education to support your government. And yet in our own day, this principle is universally neglected. He's complaining about the state of affairs in ancient Greece. And it'll be of no avail unless the young are trained by habit and education in the spirit of the Constitution. That's part of what books do for us, isn't it? They train us in that, right? Hugely important.
Right. I mean, just read a book, read the Constitution, read the Federalist Society. The other problem of social media is the short attention spans, and people are not reading novels. I wasn't a part of the Common Core fight, so I only know it from the outside. But as I understand it, it decreased even further the role of literature in English classes. And it was all about nonfiction because we have to teach critical thinking, one of the most overrated concepts in education. Here's how you learn to do critical thinking. You do not do critical thinking. You learn the periodic table. You learn to conjugate German verbs. You learn the spread of civilization in the ancient Mediterranean. You do not teach critical thinking because when you give these products of ed schools the capacity to teach critical thinking, you know what that translates as? We're going to be anti-capitalist. Ooh, we're going to read advertisements and we're going to find out the subliminal messages of, General Motors or something. Education should be about immersing yourself in long thought, in novels, in extended argument, and the ability of literature to take us into worlds that we would otherwise never encounter in our petty, constricted, narrow lives.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. How about that? And that's what the Western canon does, that it helps to stir the moral imagination, to form the moral imagination. Here's a question from the audience. Well, what is the elite university's end game? If they tear down society, won't they destroy themselves?
Good point. Good. I wouldn't give them the credit of being that farsighted and rational in their thinking. I think at this point, they're operating out of hatred. If you can't create something, you can tear it down. What does the mob do? It destroys. That is mob power. That's what these students are doing. They cannot create what is being, there is hatred for a civilization deemed too white and too male. And they cannot replace it. They cannot continue it, but they can tear it down. The statues are coming down. I have predicted that we are not going to have a White House for much longer. We are going to have to rename it. We are going to have to, Washington, D.C. will not survive much longer. It will have to be renamed. Don't assume that the Lincoln Memorial will survive. Do not assume. Nothing, things that were unthinkable several years ago have now become thinkable. So the universities, sadly though, can bank on the fanatical obsession of parents to credentialize their children and the fanatical obsession of alumni to get their children and grandchildren into those universities, to credentialize them. So even conservatives who know better are still donating to their alma mater for one reason only. They want to get their kids in. They have got to stop that. Give to institutions that can rebuild our civil society, whether it's vocational education, the Boy Scouts who have been defunded by corporations for the trivial reason that the gay lobby in corporations decided that their crusade was more important than the heroic work that the Boy Scouts were doing in inner cities that I have observed firsthand of these young boys tying knots in church basements in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Bronzeville, saluting the flag. It's a thing of beauty that breaks your heart. Inner city scouting was doing extraordinary things. It's now been decimated and defunding because corporations have pulled out. But there are institutions that will rebuild society, that these alumni, whether it's of an Ivy League, of a state school, do not give them another damn cent. And I would say to all of you, if any of you are giving to your college alma mater, you're part of the problem, not the solution. And you can
Okay.
see me afterwards and we'll talk it out.
Ms. McDonald, I don't know that we've ever really seen the kind of self-loathing for our civilization, for American culture and Western culture. We saw it to some degree, you could argue, in the 60s, but this is different. This feels different to me. I'm just about old enough to remember some of that from the late 60s and 70s, but this feels different to me. Do you feel the same way? And how do we explain it?
Yes, absolutely. There's nothing like it. To me, you know, when I've been on college campuses and I've seen the campus mob, directed myself, when I see the video of Nicholas Christakis at Yale, surrounded for 2 hours by screaming hyenas, cursing at him, using the foulest language, saying you are disgusting, playing the race card against him, one thinks of the Chinese Cultural Revolution as the only possible precedent, but that was different. It was by and large the masses turning on the elites, and so you had the intellectuals being driven out, their learning being disparaged, and you know, the natural aristocracy being torn down. What is so unprecedented in this current moment is the elites turning on themselves, turning on its own civilization.
Yes.
So yes, I don't think there's a precedent for this. And young people being told that there is nothing in your heritage to be proud of. You stand for white supremacy, for colonialism, for oppression, when in fact, there is not a single civilization that has not, and in many cases, is not still engaged in genocide, in ruthless misogyny. Go try holding a gay pride march in Uganda and see how far you get. The university today is the most tolerant environment in human history towards society's traditionally marginalized groups, and yet it pretends to be an epicenter of racism and discrimination, and these college presidents are living an absolute lie. They have to know that every faculty search is one concerted effort to hire, find, and promote as many underrepresented minorities and females as possible, and yet these college presidents are turning on their own college and saying, oh, woe is me, we're so racist, whether it's Christopher Eisgruber at Yale or Peter Eisgruber, excuse me, at Princeton, Peter Salovey at Yale, Ruger at UPenn Law School. They're all living a lie. So how you raise children that are told there is nothing to be proud of, and what that results in a decade or so, I don't know, but it is a scary experiment that we better cut off at the pass before we actually see its final results.
Yes, yes, yes. And jumping off that point, this I think will be our last question. It does seem that this negation, this desire to negate our culture, our civilization, and the desire to judge, to pass judgment, and it almost has a kind of cult-like quality to it. Do you want to just talk about that, and maybe how do we shake people loose from a cult? I mean, this is a challenging moment we're in, isn't it?
Wow, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, reality therapy, I guess. Taking them, send them to Cuba, send them to Venezuela.
Reality checks.
Yes, let them see what a non-Western culture really looks like. that does not respect individual rights, that
Yes.
does not respect private property. Don't have these school year abroads where these Americans, they go and they insulate themselves. They don't even bother trying to speak the foreign language when they're in Florence. They want to just hang out with their fellow Americans. That's a waste of time. Send them to the third world.
Yeah.
Let them see what a true tribal society is like.
On this point, back in the 90s, when I was working at a think tank in Washington, D.C., we had an intern, I can't remember his name now, tall, thin, young man, well-spoken. He came from Somalia, a failed state, and here he is in America, and he sees this amazing, prosperous country. He's surrounded by young people who like him, who accept him, and every day he would come into the office and he'd say, America, what a country. What a country. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Heather and Joe, thank you so much for a wonderful program. Ladies and gentlemen, Heather McDonald. Thank you for being here this evening, everyone. We'll see you on April 12th for our library, Age of Acrimony. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Our high school students, please come up front for a picture with our speaker. Thank you.